Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel. Chapter 10, Finding the Colonial Gate. Maximillian Roivas sat at his desk, writing in his journal. He had already been in the family home for a few weeks, and he knew that his father had a few secrets in the place. He was determined to find out what they were, and even to discover why it seemed his father had gone mad. He then closed the journal and stood up. As he walked towards the door, he was stunned to see a bag of ammo for a flintlock pistol. He was surprised to see it lying about, but he had heard that the colonies were becoming concerned about how they were represented in England. He also remembered that due to the troubled times, he had been carrying his own flintlock pistol all the time. He picked up the bag and was determined to store it someplace safe. He then left the upstairs study that he was working in. He then entered the door to his right. It was the washroom. As he looked around, he noticed one of the household staff was cleaning the floor. He also noticed another bag of ammo. He picked it up and said, "Do you know who left this lying here?" When he got no response, he just said, "If you don't know, that's all right. I'll place it back where it belongs." He knew that was true. However, he still had never seen where there were any other guns in the place. He then left the room and headed down the hallway towards the stained glass window. He always wondered about the window and why his family had it put in. As he continued down the hall, he checked the door to the servants' room. It was locked, but that was all right. He wasn't about to bother them if they were resting. When he reached the window, he glanced down at the table, thinking he saw something there. However, he didn't see anything. He then doubled back, heading to the master bedroom. As he walked to it, he found more bags of ammo. He had never heard of so much ammo being laid out so recklessly. He then entered the master bedroom. As he entered, he noticed a letter on the nightstand. He walked over to it and opened the letter. As he read it, he learned his father, Aaron, had discovered an odd book entitled The Tome of Eternal Darkness. After reading that, he could swear that his father was disturbed in his old age. He then noticed on the mantel in the room a stone slab with an odd symbol on it. He picked up the slab and saw 2 words and read them aloud. "Redgamore area." It then disappeared and Maximillian blinked. He then looked at the servant and saw he was a bit distressed. He walked over and said, "Lad, why don't you take a break? You've been working too hard." He then opened the door to the private washroom and stepped over to the sink to wash out his eyes. Once he was sure that his sight was normal again, he noticed another bag of ammo. He picked it up and said, "Who is leaving this ammo all over the place?" He left the washroom and headed to the foyer to go downstairs. As he entered the foyer, he glanced over at one of the maids dusting the walls. He thought it was odd for her to be doing that, but then it was a big place. He wondered if the servants cleaning the place had a full-time job just doing that. He then descended the one set of steps and stopped by the one servant scrubbing the floor. Before he could say anything, he heard the servant mutter something about the room being cold. That was odd, because he felt no chill in the room. He then walked towards the back of the room, away from the door to the kitchen. He glanced at the right wall and saw a portrait of the area, and noticed something odd. In the portrait there was a door, but on the wall where the door would be was a triangle with an odd blue symbol on it. He then looked to the left and saw a strange picture on the wall, with similar symbols in a triangular pattern, around a fourth odd symbol. He left that area puzzled, and started towards the kitchen, picking up another sack of ammo for the pistol. As he walked, he stopped by a clock. He saw the time on it, and thought it was odd that the clock was stopped on 3:33. He then noticed another letter by the old clock. He picked it up and read it. This letter mentioned the house had been forsaken by something called the Ancients. Maximillian started to wonder if his father had gone mad in the end. He then entered the kitchen. As he entered the kitchen, Maximillian noticed a few things. The first was a stone tablet which had an odd symbol with the word Zealothoth over it. He walked over and grabbed it. The second he grabbed it, it disappeared from sight, just like the other stone slab he found. He then noticed that another sack of ammo was in the room. That disturbed him, especially when he heard the one maid in the room muttering to herself. He then walked over to the pantry door and wondered why it was open. As he looked in, he saw the handle for a pump in it. He picked it up, thinking it would be best to keep that out of reach of a crazed person. After hearing the one maid mutter, it would be best to keep anything dangerous out of her hands. He then left through the rear door of the kitchen and went to the dining room from the foyer. As he entered the room, he noticed the one servant working in the room and saw how clean the room was. He then walked over to the servant and said, "Good job. Maybe you should take the rest of the day off." He was puzzled that the servant didn't respond. He then glanced over at the fireplace and saw the same portrait that was out in the foyer. However, on the mantel was the statue of a raven and 4 miniature diagrams of all the runes in the picture. He then noticed a message on the portrait mentioning about darkness spreading its wings in front of Julios' greatest foe, and a passage opening up. He then looked at all the small images, and then noticed that one of the symbols looked like the one he saw on the stone slab he found earlier. He carefully moved the statue in front of it, and was surprised when he heard a rumbling sound, like a door opening. He looked down at the fireplace and saw a path open right where a roaring fire was a moment ago. He slowly got down on his knees and was surprised to see a room on the other side. Maximillian stood up once he was in the room and was surprised at everything in the room. It was as if the room was its own research area. Notes and pictures were scattered through the room. He also noticed a desk in the room and was startled to see an old, ominous-looking book on it. As he walked over to it, he remembered the note his father left about the book. He walked over to the desk and looked at the book. He wondered if the book was the book his father mentioned. He picked it up and opened it, knowing he might be tempting fate. The second he opened it, he saw all sorts of images. He gasped in fright when it was all done, but then he backstepped into the wall when he saw a strangely dressed man in front of him. Richard Cale realized he must have startled Maximillian Roivas. He quickly put up his hands in front of him and said, "Pardon my sudden appearance, Maximillian, but I'm here to aid you." He noticed that Maximillian appeared to relax a bit, and he continued, "This may be hard to believe, but I come from the future. Your ancestor found that book you hold in this very room. As they have been reading it, I have been jumping back and forth in time. We are trying to fight the darkness that is coming." He watched as Maximillian looked at him cautiously and said, "If what you're saying is true, then where is the danger that this darkness brings?" Richard could tell that Maximillian was not stupid, but also a scholar. Any true skeptic would doubt the story he just told. Richard felt his blood run cold when he heard a loud thud in the direction of the foyer, and a loud, bone-chilling roar. It was the sound of one of the three-headed horrors he had seen in previous encounters. He also saw Maximilian's eyes go wide at the sound as well. He then said, "That is the sign that the creatures are here. It's a servant of an old evil man named Pius Augustus. There is something he wants under this mansion, and now that you've found the book, he knows you are on to him." He watched as Maximillian shook his head and said, "So, this is what my father meant." He then saw a note slide out of the book as Maximillian held it. He saw Maximillian pick it up and read it. Soon he listened as Maximillian said, "So, the mansion is over an ancient city underground. Could the creatures be coming from there?" Richard considered the question carefully before answering it. He then said, "It is possible. That city, whatever it is called, may be a focal point for these creatures. However, before we engage them, you might want to find a weapon to fight with. That pistol you're carrying might not be enough. You might want to grab the saber on the wall there, and anything else that might help us defeat the creatures." He watched as Maximillian nodded and said, "Indeed. However, if you think one pistol won't be enough, I can handle two at once." He then watched as Maximillian took a second pistol from the wall. He then noticed that Maximillian was looking at a strange parchment. Richard walked over to his side and said, "That might be helpful. It says something about revealing what can't be seen. All we need are the runes to make the spell work." He watched as Maximillian nodded and picked up the paper. At least now they had everything important that they might need. Richard then made his way to the entrance that Maximillian had come in. As he crawled through, he heard two things. The first was Maximillian crawling in behind him. The second was an unmistakable hiss he had heard before. It was one of the bone thieves. He took a quick glance around the room and saw the only other being in the room was apparently a servant. Richard knew what it really was now. As he slowly got up, he heard Maximillian say, "Don't worry about that man. He's just a servant. He looks after the house." He watched as Maximillian stood up, and the servant started to advance. Before the servant moved any farther, Richard said, "Maybe at one time he did, but not anymore." He quickly swung his sword in an arc as he advanced towards the servant. He heard Maximillian gasp as his sword connected and made a severe cut in the man's throat. Soon he saw the man shake, and his body exploded in a hideous splat. He looked at the creature face to face as it hissed at him again. Before Richard could react, the creature jumped forward right at his face. He was thankful that before the creature could reach his face, Maximillian had rushed forward and swung his sword in such a way that the creature's head was severed. The creature collapsed to the floor, dead. He then watched as Maximillian looked at the creature in horror and fascination, and then opened the book. Richard watched as Maximillian quickly wrote things down. When he was done, Maximillian looked at him and said, "It's only right we have proof of these things, and I am a doctor." Richard nodded and said, "Very wise, but let's hope not all the servants have fallen victim to bone thieves." Richard then saw the tomb. The tome was glowing. Richard walked over to Maximillian and said, "Why don't you cut that creature some more? It actually has a therapeutic effect." He watched as Maximillian did so, and then looked at the tome. He was surprised when he saw 3 entries had appeared in the book, each a type of bone thief. He paged through them and said, "Now this is odd." He continued looking at the book as Maximillian walked over to his side and said, "What is?" He then heard Maximillian gasp and say, "I only wrote about one of those things. Where did those other entries come from?" Richard realized it might be hard to understand right now, so he just said, "I'll tell you later when I'm sure of it. Right now, we need to handle the horror that is in your foyer." Richard then headed for the door and opened it, stopping only to say, "By the way, I hope you can move fast. The horror tends to have a lightning type of attack." He saw Maximillian nod, and then they headed into the foyer. As they ran forward, Richard saw the horror was near the base of the stairs and approaching a cowering servant. As they ran, he heard Maximillian shout, "Get away from that thing! We'll stop it!" Richard then swung his sword and timed it just right as the horror turned towards them, and his sword severed its one neck. Richard jumped back as the creature tried to shock him and said, "Aim for the necks. Taking out all 3 of its heads will kill it." It was also then that he saw a rune floating in the creature's body. He then knew what had to be done and doubled his efforts. He smiled when his sword cut off the creature's right neck, leaving only the middle head left. However, he didn't jump back in time to dodge the backswing, and the creature sent him flying away. He landed on his back at the base of the one set of stairs. As he looked up, he saw Maximillian sever the last neck. As he watched, he heard an unearthly voice say, "Requiem," and saw the rune disappear in a flash of yellow lightning. He then watched as Maximillian started to examine the creature. Richard also looked up the steps to see an upstairs maid coming down. Richard started to slowly get up when he heard a hiss come from her. He moved faster to get up, but by the time he was up, the maid backhanded him, knocking him back to the floor. As he fell, he heard his sword slide away from him. He started to crawl away from the maid and back towards his sword. While he was fast, the creature moved faster. Before he could even shout for help, he heard a shot and watched as the back of the maid's head shattered. He then heard Maximillian say, "I won't let you foul creatures kill this man." Richard quickly grabbed his sword and got to his feet as the maid exploded, revealing another bone thief. Before the creature could fully recover from its exposure, Richard quickly swung his sword and removed the creature's head. As the body collapsed, he chopped it to bits. When he was done, he looked at Maximillian and said, "Thank you, Maximillian. I feel before all this is done, our Sanity will have had a nasty blow to it." He watched as Maximillian looked over at the one servant in the room and said, "Not just ours. However, due to that creature, we now have the runes to power the spell we found. Perhaps we can reveal the basement door." Richard glanced at where the door was, finding a blue triangle there. Richard held up his hand and said, "Do you have a green rune?" He watched as Maximillian shook his head, and Richard then said, "Then we need to find it. Mind if I check the tome again?" He saw Maximillian offer him the book and quickly checked it, now finding 3 horror autopsies in it. He then nodded and said, "Let's check the kitchen and make sure it's clear before we check upstairs." He watched Maximillian nod and say, "That is an excellent idea. I had found a stone with a rune on it in the kitchen. Maybe now we'll find the rune in there." He then watched as Maximillian headed for the rear door of the kitchen, saying, "Might as well go in the back door. It might surprise any creatures in the room." As they entered, Richard heard a familiar stepping splat sound. He quickly surveyed the room and saw 2 maids not facing him, and walking towards them was a trapper. Richard leaned over quietly and said, "The thing is blind and reacts to sound. One shot will stop it. If it uses its ability, it will send you to another dimension." He noticed Maximillian nodded his understanding and took aim. As he did, Richard slowly moved closer to the maids. He saw that one seemed to be putting something in the pot on the fire. When Richard heard the shot fired and the trapper die, he heard another hiss of a bone thief. He then saw the other maid rise and face him, a look of hatred and fury on her face. Richard quickly backpedaled and swung his sword. He was thankful his swing was true, decapitating the doomed woman and allowing the bone thief to burst forth. He went to return the swing, only to find that his return swing would not have room to be effective. He waited as the creature prepared to pounce. Before it could, Richard saw a sword come down on the creature's neck, severing it. Richard looked over at Maximillian as he said, "I hope this is the last of these things that we encounter. If they keep this up, all the staff will be gone." Richard then noticed what the maid was putting in the pot. He started for the door as he said, "If they aren't physically gone, they'll be mentally gone. Whatever you do tonight, don't have stew." As he walked out of the kitchen, he heard Maximillian follow him, saying, "Maybe we should check upstairs. As far as I know, there are 2 servants up there. I hope they don't have creatures in them as well." Richard had to nod in agreement. When they got upstairs, Richard said, "Which room do you want to check first?" I know the master bedroom is to the right." He turned back and saw Maximilian nod as he said, "Yes, I do hope he is all right in there." He followed as Maximilian walked to the door and opened it. He waited for a moment, listening as he heard him say from the door, "Are you all right?" He listened another moment, and then heard him say, "It will be all right. I'll be back in a little bit. Just stay in here for now." He watched as Maximilian closed the door and then said to him, "I think he may be himself, but I don't think he thinks he is. He might be close to mentally losing it." Richard turned and started walking to the opposite end of the hall, saying, "I know that feeling. However, before we help any of them recover their sanity, we should be sure nothing else will take it from them." He wasn't sure how effective that course of action would be, but it would have to be enough. It was at that point they were at the door that had to be to the smaller washroom. He remembered that in Alex's time the room was dark. He hoped that it wasn't the case now. As he reached for the doorknob, he heard Maximilian say, "Let's hope the servant cleaning in there is all right. There isn't much room in there." Richard then opened the door and stepped inside the small room. As Maximilian followed him in, he glanced right at the servant's eyes and saw a look of pure hatred. Richard went to react, but felt the fist hit him hard in the lower chest, knocking the wind out of him. As he gasped for air, he could only watch as Maximilian did what was needed to be done. He closed his eyes when his ally decapitated the servant, only to hear the bone thief emerge. Almost as soon as it appeared, he heard Maximilian shout, "Be gone, beast! Back to the devil with you!" He then heard the creature's death wail. As he started to get up, he felt Maximilian grab his hand. He then said, "I'm sorry you had to do that. I think those creatures enhance the strength of their victims." He then stood up and said, "Maybe we should leave this room and head to the window. I glanced down to it, and something didn't seem right. Maybe it's not the same window I saw before." As they left the room, he heard Maximilian reply, "You may be right about that window. I noticed something by the one table by the window. I also suggest checking the servants' quarters, but the door is locked." Richard looked at the door and nodded. As they neared it, he saw an envelope beside the table, and saw what looked like a green seal on the envelope. He then said, "Something tells me that the envelope has a clue. Just be careful about picking it up." He saw Maximilian nod and approach the envelope. It was then that Richard felt dizzy, and he braced himself on the wall. He commented aloud, "Not now. I don't need this to happen now." He was suffering a blink attack. He knew he'd need a moment to recover from the attack, but he also knew what to expect. He glanced over at the envelope as Maximilian pulled it out, and saw the seal was now red. It was then he also heard the window shatter. Maximilian jumped when he heard the window shatter. He then realized that the envelope held an important item. He readied his sword for the creature's attack, and then saw it wasn't focused on him, but his ally, Richard. He quickly ran for Richard's side, but saw the creature was faster and leapt, landing on Richard's shoulders, and prepared to plunge its scythe-like arms into Richard's eyes. He grabbed the creature and pulled it off, throwing it to the floor. While it was dazed, he quickly brought his sword on the creature's body, slicing it in half. As the creature died, he walked over to Richard and said, "Are you all right? What happened that you weren't alert?" He watched as Richard leaned against the wall and said, "I'll be fine. I just had a blink attack." He looked at Richard a bit puzzled and heard Richard say, "It's just a period of dizziness. I'll be fine." He could tell Richard wasn't telling him everything, and that what he wasn't telling him was something he needed to keep quiet. Maximillian nodded and said, "All right, let's check out this envelope." He then looked at the envelope and opened it. He was surprised to find a key in it, and then read the note. After he read it, he looked at Richard and said, "It looks like the creatures are after the book. And if all these notes are right, the basement, to which the key is for, is the gateway to an underground city. We might want to get into the basement." He saw Richard nod and say, "Very wise. Let's hope it's going to be a quiet walk to the basement, and also hope we can reveal the door." Maximilian nodded and then led the way to the door to the foyer. When they reached the door, he said, "I'll go first. I'm not sure if you are fully ready to fight again." He watched as Richard nodded, and then he opened the door. Once he was through it, he was aware that something was odd. He looked back in the door and saw Richard was gone. He then noticed the odd tint on all the walls. He also heard no one in the foyer. As he stepped down the stairs, he heard another of the horror creatures appear. Like the one before, this one had a rune in it. He also knew he had to destroy it alone. He hoped his age wouldn't factor against him. He then rushed the creature and plunged his saber into one of the creature's necks. He jumped back to avoid the creature's attack and then repeated his strike 2 more times, destroying the monstrosity. As the thing died, he saw the rune come out of it in a flash of red lightning. He then heard the word that was on the slab he found earlier. When it was all said and done, he blinked his eyes. He then heard Richard say, "Maximillian, are you all right?" He turned to see Richard behind him, and also see that he hadn't entered the foyer at all. He then turned to Richard and said, "I could have sworn I just fought one of those horrors. I even found a rune." He then remembered about the tome and opened it. He was shocked to see the rune was now in the book. He also realized it was an alignment rune. He then looked at Richard and said, "I have the rune, but did I enter the room?" Richard shook his head and said, "No, you didn't move from that spot. I think it was a trick of the mind. The dark forces that are after us are good at that." Maximillian could tell there was a ring of truth in Richard's voice. He then heard him say, "Maybe we should head down to the basement door together." He nodded in agreement and led the way. As they entered the foyer and headed down the steps, he started to wonder about his own sanity. He knew what they were facing was real. However, it just seemed unreal. When they reached the bottom of the steps, he looked at the wall where the door was supposed to be and said to Richard, "All right, what do we do now?" He watched as Richard looked at the wall, then at the 2 portraits on the wall. He then watched as Richard looked at the triangular green pattern on the wall. Soon he heard Richard say, "Pius has chosen Zelatoth." so to defeat him we will have to use Chaturga. That should be the rune you just found. Try casting the Reveal Invisible spell using that rune. Maximillian opened the tome and found the spell, and did what Richard said needed to be done. As the spell was cast, he was amazed to see the pattern disappear and a door appear in its place. He looked at the wall and saw that it now looked like the portrait. Almost without thinking, he pulled out the key and used it to unlock the door. When he heard the tumblers click, he said, "We found the key. We found our key. Now let's find out what is down there. Let's see if the path to the ancient city is there." He then stopped and stood straight. He thought he was now losing his mind. He watched as Richard turned to another page in the tome and said, "First, cast that spell. It will recover your sanity, and if you use the green rune." He looked at Richard and saw honesty in the man's eyes. Although he was leery about doing it, he cast the recovery spell as Richard had directed. As soon as the spell was done, he felt mentally better. He then looked at Richard, who said, "The red rune will recover health. I'm not sure if the blue rune will work with the spell or not." He then watched as Richard opened the basement door and said, "Shall we?" Maximillian nodded and entered the room, and waited for Richard to close the door. Once that was done, he listened for a moment, and heard movement down the steps. He turned to Richard and said, "It must be those creatures. Can you tell how many?" He watched as Richard listened for a moment and said, "Sounds like they are human-sized, but no hisses yet. It might be the zombies. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them holds a bone thief inside. If that's the case, I'll take on that one." He watched then as Richard headed down the steps. When Richard was at the bottom, he heard a hiss, and watched as Richard headed to the bigger part of the basement. He then saw a zombie shuffle into view and ran down the steps. As he reached the bottom, he saw the thing turn to look at him. As it did, he felt his sanity start to drop, but he acted. He quickly swung his saber and took out the creature's head. He was startled when, while the head was gone, a ghostly green head had taken its place. Before the creature could strike him, he quickly struck the two arms, removing them and causing the creature to fall. He then started to examine it. As he did, he heard the other creature explode and listened as Richard killed the hissing beast. He took a breath of relief when it was done and said, "I hope that was it for these creatures." He watched as Richard looked around and said, "It might be. Can I see the tome?" He nodded and handed Richard the book again. As he looked through, he saw the man's brow furrow. He then heard him say, "3 more entries. But I've seen 4 types. There's one missing." Maximillian looked around the room but saw no other creatures. "Well, once we find the way to the city, we'll find your missing creature." He then looked around the basement, noticing the small pool in the corner. He had a feeling that was their way to it. Before he went to the pool, he noticed some ammo for his pistols. He walked over to it, picked it up, and saw Richard looking at 2 items. One was another scroll of paper, which had a spell called Damage Field written on it. He also saw it used a rune that they did not have yet. He then saw a stone slab mentioning that rune. He picked up the slab and said, "Well, We found the slab for the protect rune called Bankarok. As he said it, the slab disappeared, as well as the paper that Richard was now holding. Richard then said, "They'll both be in the book now." He watched as Richard looked over at the pool and said, "Maximillian, did all houses like this have a well in them?" Maximillian walked over to it and saw the pump mechanism. He put the pump handle in the mechanism and said, "I don't think this is a well. The handle for the pump was in the pantry. Let's see what happens when I use the pump." He started pumping and watched as the water quickly drained out, and saw a panel in the bottom of the pool slide away, revealing a ladder. He then smiled and said, "Your turn to go first." He watched as Richard smiled and said, "Fair enough. You open the door this time." He watched as Richard climbed down the ladder. He quickly followed, and as he climbed down, he heard Richard say, "I see our missing rune and missing creature." When he reached the bottom, he turned to see Richard lopping off the second arm, leaving the creature armless. Before he watched as Richard turned and said, "You want to finish him off? He has the Bankarok rune in him." He nodded and said, "Indeed." He then lopped off the creature's head. As the creature fell, he saw the rune leave the creature's body in a flash of yellow lightning. He then examined the creature. When he was done, he looked to see Richard descending a large circular stairwell. He quickly followed and saw Richard stop at a doorway to a balcony. When he walked out to it, he saw Richard looking in awe at a giant city. He then said, "So this is the city of Enga." As he looked, he started to wonder if a saber and his flintlock pistols would be enough. Richard looked out at the city, taking note of everything. It was huge, and he felt they wouldn't even begin to examine everything. He made note of the 9 pillars encircling the city. Maybe they will figure out their purpose. He swallowed and then said, "Maximillian, enchant the pistols. Use the alignment rune you just found." He looked on at the city and then at the floor of the balcony. He was stunned to see Mantarok's rune engraved on the balcony. He started to wonder why the rune was there, but then looked over to Maximillian. He was not surprised to see Maximillian holding 2 pistols that now glowed red. "I'm ready to go. I hope this is the right thing to do." Richard nodded and then headed back to the steps. As he started back down, he saw a yellow rune barrier disappear. As they descended, he heard Maximillian say, "Richard, what should we do if there is more down there than the creatures we've encountered?" As they neared the bottom, Richard said, "We double back and try to get more help. Odds are, when we do that, I might be called back to my time." He heard Maximillian gulp as they reached the bottom step, as he said, "I may have a hard time convincing them, but I will do my best." As they stepped out of the stairwell, Richard was stunned to see an indescribable green creature apparently looking at them. He would think it was looking at them, but he saw no eyes on the creature. He could only think that it looked like two human torsos fused together. He then heard Maximillian say, "What in the name of God is that?" Richard stopped and looked back when he heard a sound behind him. He saw runes on the floor glowing green and in a polygon-type pattern. He then said, "It must be a guardian of some sort. I have a feeling we should destroy it and then double back." He then saw lightning coming from the creature and straight at him. He pushed Maximillian out of the way and jumped to the side as the lightning stopped at the spot they were at. Richard then said, "I'll draw its attacks. Shoot it with the pistols." He then ran as the creature and worked to keep himself out of Maximilian's line of fire. For the first time, he knew his sword would be useless. If these creatures were getting more powerful, he was not going to be able to fight them. As he ran and avoided the lightning strikes, he heard the shots of the pistols. He saw two connect, and the creature disappeared, turning into a ball of light. He watched as the light flew around and kept following it. He knew that the creature would reappear when it stopped, and hoped it wasn't too close to Maximillian. When it did reappear, he glanced over to see Maximillian was just done reloading the guns, and saw him fire again at the creature. It had taken a total of 4 enchanted shots, and the creature fell. He then watched as Maximillian quickly examined the creature. When he was done, he said, "By the size of this city, there must be hundreds of these creatures there." Richard nodded and said, "Yes, we will need help. Maximillian, head back up. I'm sure you can get help in time. I don't think they are going to rush up." He saw Maximillian nod and started to head up. Before Maximillian left, he said, "Maximillian, remember the time 3:33. It's very important." He heard Maximillian say, "That's the time on the clock in the foyer. I'll remember that." He then saw Maximillian run up the steps. Richard was thankful that Maximillian would remember that. As he looked over the area, he knew that he was only safe for a little bit. He started to head back to the steps when he heard a voice come from the gate that the creature had guarded. "I thought I heard a familiar voice. You won't get away this time. You and your friend will go mad if I don't kill you first." Richard ran at those words. If Pius was in Enga now, then Pius was there in the present. Richard then quickly ran up the steps and reached the balcony. When he hit that spot, he saw the world dissolve and the study slowly return to view. As that happened, he also knew that most likely Maximillian had somehow fell to the madness that Pius taunted.